so much of it is focused on the idea of that blessing and what that means, what that brings to our lives, how that changes us and who we are in our relationship to Him. And so that practice and that concept of blessing, it is an essential part of this week's Torah portion. And sadly, it's something that we in our culture don't typically practice. It's not something that most of us have grown up with, besides those that are a little younger. So we didn't necessarily grow up with that. And so we've lost that concept of blessing. We don't realize the powerful impact, even on the lives of the future generations, on the lives of our children, that blessing can have. And I've talked to, and I've shared this before, I've talked to so many men, older men over the years, who realize that it's been absent from their lives. They realize, and they'll say things like, they have no memory that their father ever told them that they loved them, ever really spoke kind words to them, things like that. And so they realize that that's missing. And so when you look at how blessing is used in the Scriptures, some of the things that it does is something that we've talked about. One thing is that it connects one generation to the next, or to the future generations. That's one of the points that it's supposed to do. It's supposed to help make that connection. It's supposed to help pass on that influence, that knowledge, those things that they have gained and experienced, so that the future generations will appreciate where they've been, but also those older generations can speak good into the future through the concept of blessing. We'll also see, especially in this portion when he goes to the whole tribes and all the peoples, it reveals character traits that a person will exhibit in their life, or a tribe will exhibit in their existence, both strengths and weaknesses. This one especially, you read some of the blessings about the tribes and you're like, man, do you have to say that? Right? But it's still there. It reveals these things about them. It often is used to speak prophetically about a person's future and about their descendants. You see that in Genesis 49, verse 1. When Jacob calls his sons, he says to them, "Gather together so that I can tell you what will happen to you in the last days." He's speaking these things prophetically about their future. And then also to pass relationship and connection and promise, to God and His plans. So much of the blessing is you need to be included in what God is doing. And I'm going to speak the blessing over you. This was, I bless you in the name of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that promise might continue on in you. And we've been singing about blessing. It's that word barak. The songs that we've been using, it comes out in the form of Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you. It means that idea to bless, but it also means to kneel and to bend the knee. That's why so many times, especially when you see Jewish people at the Wailing Wall and in prayer, when they speak the prayers and the blessings of God, they will literally bend the knee and things like that. They'll do that over and over again because it's a part of the blessing. Literally means to bend the knee. Or it's also to cause to kneel. We've talked about that previously. But included in that is to praise, to salute. It's also in the sense of it can be used as a curse. But to speak over or to speak to someone's life and someone's presence. Its first usage is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 22, when God is speaking to the creatures on day 4. The first things that He's using to fill, He says, He blesses them and says, day 6, you're right. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Right? So that's the first time this idea of blessing is used. And when we come into Genesis 48, we see an important part of blessing. He says, after these things, someone told Joseph, this is after they have moved down, after they moved into the land, "Behold, your father is sick." And so he took his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. When someone told Jacob, saying, "Behold, your son Joseph has come to you," Israel summoned his strength and sat up in the bed. So Jacob, Israel, he is weakening, he is sick. And they have no idea how much time he's got left in life. No idea that they'll ever have another opportunity to speak and to talk and to share. And so Jacob is weak and sick until what moment? When he knows that Joseph has come. When Joseph has come, he regains his strength. And is that not true in a spiritual sense? Israel, the people of Israel live. But until Messiah ben Yosef comes, until they see him and recognize him and know who he is, they are still sick with sin and death, right? Like the rest of us. They're not at their full strength until they know that Messiah has come. Israel's strength will return when Messiah is presented before him and he is received. That's an important thing for us to know. That today Israel, the Jewish people, as strong as they are not as strong as they could be. Because apart from Messiah, they'll still be sick. They'll still be lacking the strength that they need. And the same is true even for us as Gentiles. Military might, as much as that's been a word in a conversation in the last week, my goodness, hasn't a lot of things been happening in the last week? Military might does not measure real strength, but our relationship to Messiah is what gives us strength. So Israel, he summons his strength and sat up in the bed. That word strength is chazak. And we'll use this one at the end of this message today, because it's something that comes at the end. Oftentimes the tradition is when you finish reading a book in the Torah cycle, you say this, chazak, chazak. How's it go? Yep, y'all know that. But it means to strengthen, to prevail, to harden, to become or to make strong, to be courageous. You'll see that in Joshua where he talks about now be courageous, encourage, or to even be resolute, to be resolved in all of these things. So Israel, the Prince of God, is summoning all of his strength, all of his resolve, all of his courage and strength. And then he sat on the side of his bed. He was essentially seating as one in authority in the family. Even sitting up on his bed, who had more authority, Jacob or Joseph? In reality, Jacob did. Jacob did. Right? Joseph, the second in charge of Egypt, was the one who was standing before him, the one who was coming before Jacob. So Jacob was in the seat of authority, and so then he reiterated why he was the one who was seated. He reminded Joseph of his relationship with God and how he had the blessing that was passed on to him from God, from Abraham and from Isaac. Verse 3, he says, "Then Jacob said to Joseph, El Shaddai appeared to me in Luz, in the land of Canaan, and blessed me. And he said to me, I'm going to make you fruitful and multiply you and turn you into an assembly of peoples. And I will give this land to your seed after you as an everlasting possession." Remember, the first time this word of blessing was used was spoken about to the things that he was using to fill the earth. So it has a lot of the same themes happening to it even right here. So can you see how he relates God's blessing to telling him his place in God's plan? By blessing him, he has revealed this moment of, this is what I'm going to bestow into your life. This is what I'm going to do in and through you. And he says, you're going to be fruitful and multiply you. And he says that the future for him is he's going to turn him into an assembly of peoples. And interestingly enough, that word assembly, when it's used in the Septuagint, that word in the Septuagint is synagogue. Y'all should be familiar with that word. So as part of that assembly, they receive this promise, the descendants and land. You'll hear Dr. Hahn talk about that a lot. But Joseph and his children, Even though they were lost down in Egypt. Joseph was lost down in Egypt. He was lost among the nations for a long time. In blessing him and his sons, he's showing him that he still has a place in that promise, in that lineage, in that connection. He says, so now your 2 sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, they are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just like Reuben and Simeon. And so any descendant of yours whom you father after them will be yours. But they will be identified by the names of their brothers, Ephraim and Manasseh, for their inheritance. So Jacob, he claims both Ephraim and Manasseh as his own, with the same status, the same kind of privilege. They're not to be excluded from among the brotherhood, just as they are Joseph's children. They're counted as sons, just like Reuben and Simeon. So any other children that Joseph would be counted, though, they would be his. But even they, he says, any of your future children, they're going to be identified. They're going to be counted as part of Ephraim and Manasseh when it comes to receiving their inheritance in the land and in that future. It's ironic. I thought this was kind of humorous a little bit, and maybe this is just me, but it's ironic that the brotherhood, the brothers, they kick off Joseph. They get rid of one brother, right? And in return, they get 2. It hasn't helped their cause, right? They're getting 2 for the price of 1, so to speak. And he's talking about Ephraim and Manasseh in spite of the fact that they were born in Egypt, that they were out there among the nations. They were not with the family. These were boys who had grown up in Egypt, or were growing up in Egypt, in the courts of Egypt, schooled in Egypt, governed by Egypt's laws, and surrounded by the culture of Egypt. That was their experience. Like Joseph, when his brothers arrived, Ephraim and Manasseh probably looked Egyptian more than the descendants of Abraham, and Isaac, and Jacob. Many Jews today fit in that category, don't they? They don't necessarily practice the faith, or they fit in with their culture. And see, it talks about Jacob not even really able to see the boys. Their identity had to be confirmed and announced before the throne. In verse 8, it says, Israel saw Joseph's sons, and he said, who are these? And Joseph said to his father, they are my sons whom God has given me here. And he said, please bring them to me so I may bless them. Now Israel's eyes had grown heavy with old age. He could not see, so he brought them near to him and kissed them and hugged them. What's interesting about this, in almost every culture where there's a king sitting on the throne, anytime somebody comes before him, just like the book of Esther, she was not allowed to come before the king unless she was summoned, right? When anyone would come before the king, they would have to have their names and their titles, their connection, or why they are there, had to be announced. Someone essentially spoke on their behalf to allow them into the king's presence. And this will happen even when the king knows exactly who it is. Even if they know who they are, what they're there for, even if the king already knows all of that, so that the court may be in session, so to speak, that person who comes and appears before the king will still have their name spoken, will still have their identity or their purpose for being there announced. This is what's happening here. Israel is acting like the king on his throne. Who are these? What's your purpose? Who are these boys? So he announces their identity. Joseph is Ephraim and Manasseh's advocate. He is speaking on their behalf. He is their mediator to Israel. And since Joseph is a picture of Messiah, what is he revealing in this moment of what he will do for his people? He reveals a role that Messiah plays for each of us. When you and I stand before the throne of the Father, don't we need someone to speak on our behalf, to advocate for us? We need a mediator in this moment. That's how he talks about him in 1 Timothy. That's how Paul talks about him. He desires, this is the king's desire. The king's desire is that all men are to be saved and come into the knowledge of the truth, come into his presence. And he says, for there is one God and there is one mediator between God and men, a human, Messiah, Yeshua, the man, who gave himself as a ransom for all, the testimony at the proper time. He speaks on our behalf. Our mediator announces us before the Father so that we bear his name. These are mine. We bear his name, we bear his reputation, his righteousness, and not our own before the King. And so because of that, because we have this mediator, because we have the one who speaks for us, we can find out our place in the kingdom. Once we are told our place in the kingdom, we begin the process of leaving behind our old identity and learning how to live that new identity as a citizen of the kingdom of God. And the same is true for Ephraim and Manasseh. Though they would have looked Egyptian at this point, their identity changes. And so by the time you get to the Exodus, by the time that you get to, especially when Moses starts to lead the people out, they would have been numbered among Israel and not distinguished from them anymore. Their true identity had been restored. So by blessing Ephraim and Manasseh, Israel wanted to tell them their place in the kingdom and the plan of God. They weren't identified as Egyptian anymore. They were now identified as Israel. And so they were numbered just like Reuben and Simeon. When all the plagues and all those things started happening, they were right there with them, living among them. They weren't separated from them. He was showing them their place in the kingdom. Back in Genesis 48:14, it says that Israel stretched out his right hand and placed it upon Ephraim's head, though he was the younger, and his left hand upon Manasseh's head, crossing his hands, though Manasseh was the firstborn. So then he blessed Joseph. He blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has shepherded me throughout my life to this day. What's he starting with in this blessing? He's starting by reminding them of where the blessing truly comes from, of where all of this starts. The reason he's got something to say, the reason he's got something to pass on, is because of all of these things of what God has done. My fathers Abraham and Isaac walked. The God, he has shepherded me for all of these years and brought us to this time. And by crossing his hands, what's he doing? He's doing the unexpected. He's doing the unconventional. And we find out, just a little bit that Joseph doesn't like that very much, right? We usually don't like it when God does things not according to our plan. And we were talking about this last night, about why this seems to be such a common pattern, a common theme. Why, if the firstborn is so important in the normal way of things, why does God so often go against that and do something else? And one thing that we came up with is that, we never, in each generation, in each family, all these things, we never know who is going to be called and to what role that we're going to play. So if God always followed the role or the rule about the firstborn, then if you're not the firstborn, what can you do? Man, you can relax. You don't have to worry about nothing. Hey, I'm not the firstborn. It's not my problem. I don't have to be prepared for anything. you can take it easy because you've got nothing to worry about. And you see this kind of thing play out, in the history of the kings of Europe and things like that. When they have multiple children, there's the firstborn, the crown prince. Then they have the second, third, and fourth, and those guys are oftentimes they're presented as chumps, right? They don't take anything seriously so many times. They're spoiled or rotten. They have no responsibility. They become a total slacker because, hey, I'm not the firstborn. I don't have anything to worry about.
Harry.
Shh. But everyone needs by breaking this rule of the firstborn, everybody needs to be prepared at any time to step into the role that God may reveal for them. As some in Jewish thought, the Messiah can be born in every generation, right? Or in any generation. That's some of the thinking that's out there. And you have to be prepared for that. And, Moses, he's the thirdborn in his family. Gideon, he's from a small tribe, and he's not one of the more prominent people. David, he's like the 8th son, right? That's breaking the convention and such. So we always have to be prepared to that God at any time can change what our role and what our calling, what our responsibilities are. It goes on, it says, the angel, he's still talking about God's work in his life. The angel who redeemed me from all evil, may he bless the boys, and may they be called by my name, and by the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac. The complete Jewish Bible translates this like this. It says, may they remember who I am and what I stand for, and likewise my fathers Abraham and Yitzhak, who they were and what they stood for. Carries on that sense of reputation and such. He says, may they multiply to a multitude in the midst of the land. This is that connection to God, that connection to the past generation, that blessing is supposed to convey. That we are living in a long legacy of faith that must be remembered, that must be maintained, that must be passed on. Remember who I am and what I stand for. That's what I want my kids to know. That's the kind of influence that we want to always pass on to our friends, our co-workers, our family. May you remember who I am, what I stand for. If they don't know those things, they don't know what I stand for, I'm missing out on something. I'm failing to do something if they don't know who I am, if they don't know what I stand for. So here's where Joseph starts to have a problem. He says, when Joseph saw that his father had placed his right hand upon Ephraim's head, it was wrong in his eyes. So he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. Who's trying to be in control here? Joseph's trying to be in control here. Joseph said to his father, not like that, my father, because this one's the firstborn. Put your right hand upon his head. And that's something important for us to always keep in mind, that we are not in control of the blessing. We're not necessarily in control of God's purpose, God's plan, God's direction in his kingdom. We do not define what our blessing is or how it comes. That's not up to us to control. We do not get to claim the rights of the firstborn. We don't get to claim how we fit and where we are placed in these things. We receive our place from him. We can't say or demand that things be a certain way. We can't say or demand what tribe we are or whatever else. He knows who we are. But you and I, we have to wait for his declaration of where exactly we fit in his plan. We can't go around claiming what we don't know. He goes on to say, but his father refused and says, I know, my son, I know. In other words, I know what you want. I know what you think, but that's not the way it's going to work out. I'm the one who sets this agenda. He says, he also will become a people, and he also will become great. But his younger brother will become greater than he, and his seed will be the fullness of the nations. And then he blessed them that day, saying, in you shall Israel bless, by saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh, and like Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. And of course, this is still a practice that is carried on to this day. You know, the speaking of blessing of may you be like Ephraim and like Manasseh. And so it's important for us to, when we have the opportunity, to speak blessing on our children so they will remember the God who saves and remember the legacy of faith that we are a part of. We must call on him and seek his blessing so that he will reveal our role in our future, you know, listening for our future and listening for their future. And we don't always know what it is, but if we know his plan and his purpose, if we understand and have a better understanding of who he is, we remember who he is, we remember what he is doing, where he is going, then we should have some idea, know a little bit, enough to say that wherever he's going, we need to go there too. That needs to be the bottom line. And his train, so to speak, if you want to get on board his train is heading toward the gathering of his people back in the land. And there's the train right there. Hop on. That's where he's going. You know, in the last Torah portion, Jacob received God's permission to go down to Egypt in order to survive the famine, in order to be made into a great nation. In essence, he was sown out of the promised land and into the nations. Even Jacob was sown out there to do what? To multiply, to bear a crop 100 times what was sown. And I think that was successful. In essence, he was sown out of the promised land into the nations. And Jacob knew the plan and purpose of God. He knew enough to know that I'm not supposed to stay here forever. I'm not going to be here in Egypt the whole time. He knew that God's plan and purpose was not to remain among the nations, but to be gathered back to the land. And this was true not just for Jacob, but for all of Israel. This is true, and it continues to be true to this day. The desire of Jacob expresses that future about the kingdom of God for all of God's people. Because ultimately, Israel has no home among the nations. You know, in Genesis 47, at the beginning of this Torah portion, he says, now Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. As the time of Israel's death drew near, he called for his son Joseph and said to him, if I have found favor in your eyes, please put your hand under my thigh and show me faithful kindness. Please do not bury me in Egypt. Do not make my permanent place, my resting place, there. He says in verse 30, when I lie down with my fathers, you must carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. So he said, I myself will do according to your word. Swear to me, he said. So he swore to him. And then Israel bowed down in worship on the head of his staff. You know, don't bury me in Egypt. Egypt is not my home. Egypt is not where I belong. Egypt is not that promise. He belongs in the land, living in the promise, even being buried in the promise. That's more important. So in the same way, you know, Israel, the people of God, do not belong out there scattered among the nations or buried in foreign lands. You know, they are again like Joseph, who, you know, they're like Joseph in the sense of that he ends up buried in Egypt, doesn't he? And he's there for a long time. But even he has the hope of restoration to the land. You know, when you look at the end of the book of Genesis. Even Joseph shares the same desire as his father. It says, then Joseph said to his brothers, this is as he is nearing death. He says, I am about to die, but God will surely take notice of you. He will surely take notice of you and will bring you up from this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. How long into the future is he anticipating that? Several hundred years, right? But Joseph knows that this is going to happen. It may not be tomorrow, it may not be next week or next month, but it is going to happen. God will take notice of you and bring you out of this land and bring you back to the land that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made Israel's sons swear an oath, saying, when God takes notice of you, he knew enough of the purpose and plan of God to be able to say this. When God takes notice of you, you will bring my bones up from here. And so Joseph died at 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. So even Joseph doesn't want to remain buried in Egypt. He knows that at some point in the future, God will bring them all out. And even if he's dead, he wants to get on that train and go with them. Right? This is the hope, the expectation of all the people of God, of the Jewish people who have been scattered and sown among the nations, though untold thousands have died and been buried out among the nations. The hope and expectation is that their bones too will be gathered and taken back to the land. That's even the heart and the perspective of Ezekiel 37, that valley of dry bones that we read about. He says, then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. So who's included in that? The bones Ezekiel saw was everyone who qualified as the house of Israel. They are all there, counted, in this valley, so to speak. The bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off by ourselves. If we lose track of the promise, if we lose track of where God is going and that hope, then we have our whole, even our lives are shriveled up to what they could and should be. But just like Joseph, their graves as well will be opened and they will be carried out, not by Moses or the Israelites, but by God himself. He says, therefore prophesy and say to them, thus says Adonai Elohim, behold, I will open graves. I will bring you up out of your graves, my people, and I will bring you back to the land of Israel. For them to be brought back means what? If he has to say, I will bring you back to the land of Egypt, where does that mean that they are? They're not in the land. Ultimately, the easiest thing you can say, what's that?
Land of Israel.
In the land of Israel, right. They're not in the land. What?
You said Egypt.
I did?
Yes.
Well, okay. Land of Israel. Okay, there we are. But they're to be brought back to the land of Israel, that means that they are not in the land currently. And so that means they are essentially buried in Egypt. And verse 21 even goes along and confirms this. Then say to them, thus says Adonai Elohim, behold, I will take Bnei Israel. Where are they? From among the nations where they have gone, and I will gather them from every side and bring them into their own land. So they've gone, they've been scattered, they've been sown among the nations, they've been buried, but they will be gathered at the harvest. That's the promise, that's the expectation, that's where things are going. For any of those who have doubted God's presence along the way, doubted his faithfulness, his promise, these series of events, if they've come to that point where they feel like they have no hope, that has been waiting for so long, these series of events are supposed to settle the issue once and for all. The resurrection and the gathering is to settle all question and all doubt. Verse 11. Where did verse 11 go? Okay, verse 13. You will know that I am Adonai when I have opened your graves and brought you up out of your graves, my people. You'll know. When you are raised to life, you will know. All questions will be settled in things. He says, I will put my Ruach in you and you will live. I will place you in your own land. Then you will know that I, Adonai, have spoken and that I have done it. It is a declaration of Adonai. So resurrection is a key moment for the people of God, for Israel to understand just exactly who He is and how He has been faithful all the time, even though it might not have felt like it for the years in between. Resurrection is supposed to remove all and any doubt. So what's so amazing in that, when you consider, when you think of the group like the Sadducees, what was one of the things that they taught about the resurrection? Sadducees said there was no resurrection of the dead, right?
Right.
What are they doing when they say that? They're ignoring Ezekiel, for one thing. But if there really is no resurrection, they're cutting off any hope that they have for the future. And that's just crazy. They are in essence saying that they have no hope, and they really have no hope of ever knowing God. Because this resurrection is the key for them to know and experience that He is who He says He is. That comes up, that debate, that conversation comes up in 1 Corinthians. Now, if Messiah is proclaimed that He has been raised from the dead, how can some among you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? Who do you think some of those people were? They're probably debating and discussing things with at least people, maybe they came out of the Sadducee movement. Maybe they're still struggling with coming to understand those things. Maybe as they go into the synagogue, they're dealing with these perspectives and trying to share Him. But he makes a key point. If you're going to accept that there is no resurrection, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Messiah has been raised. And then our proclaiming is meaningless, and your faith also is meaningless. That's what's next. If Messiah has not been raised, then our proclaiming is meaningless, and your faith also is meaningless. So the debate about the resurrection, there's even those thoughts and those ideas about the Messiah ben Joseph and Messiah ben David and such, that Messiah ben Joseph will die, right? And then who comes along and resurrects him? Well, there was a debate that said the Messiah ben David would resurrect him. So they were having those kind of things in their own day and in Yeshua's day. But if there is no resurrection at all, then this whole thing is a discussion that's not even worth having. No resurrection means no resurrection of the Messiah, and we're wasting our time. But then you get the impression that some would sidestep this kind of issue by believing that, well, maybe resurrection was only reserved for the Messiah. Maybe only He gets raised from the dead. Only Messiah would be raised and conquered death. But then why would Paul then call Messiah the first fruits? Verse 20 says, but now Messiah has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Resurrection of just the Messiah would not warrant the title of first fruits. And first fruits from the dead, because first fruits implies what? That there is more coming. There's a second fruit, there's a third fruit, all those kind of things. Remember what the Feast of First Fruits represents. The first fruits is presented and offered with the trust, with the expectation of the harvest that is to come. So it's a demonstration of that trust in what God is going to do. They can't see the harvest right now, But they believe and trust that that harvest is coming. So the resurrection is closely tied to the gathering, closely tied to the harvest, and it's closely tied to being returned and placed in the land. That's one of the things that when you look at that word place, nuach, it means to rest, to settle down and remain, to cause to rest or give rest to make quiet, to place in the land almost is pretty closely connected to what other idea? The rest of the Sabbath, right? So even with the idea of the rest and what we do on the Sabbath is supposed to be what life is like or what it feels like in the kingdom or in the presence of God. We're supposed to be there because it also means to lay or set down, deposit, and its first usage is Genesis 2:15. If you remember what that is the moment where God creates Adam and places him in the garden. He's specifically putting him there in the garden. So just like Adonai took Adam and placed him in the garden, so the Father takes resurrected Israel, places them in the land of promise, the land of Israel. And of course, many commentators, many traditions link the actual physical land of Israel to what? That's also the area of the Garden of Eden, right? So that's what many will say. So again, resurrection and gathering back to the land are some of the keys for the Jewish people to know Adonai, to know that He keeps His promises. And so when you see these things happening, when you see the Jewish people, when you see Israel being brought back to life, brought back to the land, then the people of God should know that the day is approaching. And their own resurrection will allow them to see the first fruits of the resurrection, because that's who Yeshua is. They'll see the resurrection. They'll see Yeshua first. And their gathering back, their restoration to the land will bring with them the fullness of the nations. That's one of the goals and the benefits of the blessing that Jacob gives to Ephraim and Manasseh, because he is making an assembly of peoples, a synagogue of peoples. That's what assembly means. Remember that. A synagogue, especially in Yeshua's day, in the days where the apostles were traveling around, this was the synagogue a Jews-only club? Not really. In Acts 15 states, he talks about in every city from ancient generations, Moses was read in every synagogue every Shabbat. And so the Jews were there to hear it. Converts were there to hear it. As we were talking about on Wednesday night, there was that category, that legal status of the God-fearing Gentile were there to hear it. And they would have curious people, travelers who were there to hear the Word of God and His purposes. The assembly, the synagogue, has been open for those people to be able to hear, to shema the Word of God, and in some way or another become a part of the assembly and be given even some important roles. Caleb talks about him being a Kenizzite. Was he an important person? Yeah, he was pretty significant. He was there with Joshua and coming back with the report. Rahab of Jericho, did she become important? Yeah, slightly. That whole descendant of or ancestor of the Messiah. Yeah, she's kind of important, even though she was not a descendant of Abraham. Ruth, the Moabitess. She chose to make Naomi's people and her God, her God. Even when she was free, she had been married to Naomi's son, but he was dead. So as we talked about in Romans and such, when the husband is dead, she's free. She didn't have to go with her. She chose to. Even though she was not a descendant of Abraham, was she given an important and an amazing role? Yes, she was. Uriah the Hittite was brought in the days of Esther. There was a whole growth of Israel because of all of the persecution. You see, even Elisha, he was called the Tishbite, which many understand and believe that he was not a native born. What was brought in, he had a pretty significant part. So the assembly, the synagogue, has always been a place where people can be brought in and made part of the assembly to hear the Word of God. So we need to understand for us that there is nothing wrong with being added to, with being grafted in to the people of Israel. Because when we are made a part of the assembly, we are given a place, and the blessing can then be spoken over us. We can be included and even be given important things to do, important roles. We don't have to try and claim or manufacture an identity, a Jewish identity, to have a place among the people or have a significant role. It doesn't have to be the case. You and I, on the other hand, as we were talking about with Joseph, we really don't get to decide that anyway. We don't get to make that. We don't get to establish that. We don't get to declare or claim what we are or what we are not. He knows. The one who sits in the seat of authority knows that. The one who sits in the seat of authority decides and declares that. We should come and seek His blessing. And as we come and seek His blessing, then He will begin to reveal those things to us of who we are. And rather than speculate on what our future roles are, that we really only know when He returns, since most of us, most of us know that we are Gentiles, we know that much, let's get busy fulfilling the role that we know we have. As we've talked about, when Joseph's brothers first came down into Egypt, they didn't know that he could even speak the language, because he was using what between them? An interpreter. That's who we should be. We need to be an interpreter between Messiah, who has been lost and disguised among the nations, and the brothers, the people of Israel, as interpreters for the Messiah hidden among the nations. That's who we need to be. That's a role that we need to have as those who help remove the disguise of Egypt from Yeshua, so that His brothers, the Jewish people, can see Him for who He really is. And so they will see us desiring the life of the kingdom in Messiah and become even jealous for it for themselves, as they are awaiting the resurrection, as they are awaiting the gathering. That's that heart of Romans 11. By their false steps, salvation has come to the Gentiles to provoke Israel to jealousy. By their false step, the brothers cast Joseph out into Egypt, and Egypt was blessed because of that. But the goal is that for their own salvation, for life. Now, if their transgression leads to riches for the world, and their loss riches for the Gentiles, then how much more their fullness? But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles, insofar as I am an emissary to the Gentiles. And so I spotlight my ministry, if somehow I might provoke to jealousy my own flesh and blood for the sake and save some of them. It's not that they were no longer understood or knew themselves to be Gentiles anymore in Messiah, but their role is to help make Israel jealous. For if their rejection leads to reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead, but resurrection, but the gathering and the harvest and all of those things that come with it? We Gentiles are included because they have been scattered out among the nations. And so we need an advocate to speak on our behalf before the throne of God. We need to learn what it means to live as a part of the assembly so that we will one day be fully integrated into it. And so when the people of God all come out, as they did in Exodus, it wasn't just the Jews who went out of the Exodus, right? A whole multitude, a mixed multitude of peoples came out with them. And some were even saying only 20 to 25% of the Jewish people even left Egypt, some will say. But we need to be a part of that and realize that even as the mixed multitude, we are a part of that. Because as we are brought to the mountain, as we are brought to the kingdom of God, what was Israel and a mixed multitude, by the end of all the things, when they're ready to enter into the kingdom, how many people were left? It was one people by that point. It was one people. They had all been come together. We may start out looking like Egypt, but we should end up looking like Israel. And there's really no other way to accomplish any of this. Because in starting to look like them, we fulfill the role of making them jealous. Jealous for the Messiah. That's really the only way to effectively accomplish that. And so because of that, we need to bless each other. We need to bless our children. We need to bless God. We need to bless Israel. And so remember who they are and who He is and the promise we have all been made a part of and the legacy of faith that we are included in. He says, "For I do not want you, brothers and sisters, to be ignorant of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own eyes, that lest you think that you've got it all figured out, unless you're there trying to tell him, no, Father, put your hand this way." A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer shall come out of Zion, and he shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. He goes on and he says, "This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Concerning the good news, they are hostile for your sake, but concerning chosenness, they are loved on account of the fathers." That long generation, that long line of faith that the blessing is supposed to make us all a part of and include us in. If we never bless, we don't really understand our role and our place in it. We bless to connect one generation to the next or to the future generation, but also to bless us to what has come before us. We bless, to look through the character traits to enhance the strengths and overcome weaknesses. In blessing our kids, that's what we hope to do. We want to help them to overcome the weaknesses in their lives, but to enhance what God has built them to be. We bless for God's future and His promise. We bless to pass on the relationship and connection to God and His plans. Blessing is important, and it's essential if we're going to be who we are called to be.